Okay, so this is going to be the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary, instead of having a releasing hormone and then the posterior pituitary, so basically there's no releasing hormone and then another hormone because it's all the same neuron. So basically you have hypothalamus here, and then you have the posterior pituitary. And instead of having two sets of things happening, this is all one neuron. So you have one neuron growing with the cell body in the hypothalamus, and then the axon terminal kind of ends up in the posterior pituitary, and then the stuff is released directly into the vasculature there. So it's all one neuron. There's no releasing hormone in between. So there are two things in the posterior pituitary. So these are meant to be neurons. If it doesn't look like it, I'm sorry. Okay, so there are two things released in the posterior pituitary. One of them is oxytocin, and the other one is ADH. So we'll talk about the oxytocin part first. So oxytocin has to do with uterine contraction when you're giving birth, and it has to do with the milk ejection. But the drugs and all the what it's trying to do with the whole system has more to do with the uterine contraction. So I'll draw the rest. Okay, so basically when your uterus stretches, it stimulates the hypothalamus, and then it stimulates the release of oxytocin, and then oxytocin in turn will increase uterine contraction. And then uterine contraction kind of feeds back, so this is like a positive feedback, until eventually it stops after birth. So the uses for drugs in this pathway would be to do with either inducing labor or you want to prevent the preterm labor. So there are two drugs. One is Pitocin. So that one mimics oxytocin, so it's an agonist. And it will stimulate this whole pathway. So like I said before, this is used for induced labor, to induce labor. Also, after you give birth, your uterus kind of contracts a little bit to stop the bleeding. So it can be useful for that too, so prevent the hemorrhage after birth. And you can imagine if there's fetal distress, you wouldn't want to be contracting your uterus so much. So contraindication would be like fetal distress. And another adverse effect is that it sort of mimics the ADH, so it can have the ADH-like effect. So that's fairly straightforward. It just does what oxytocin normally do. And then the other one will be atosaban. So this does the opposite. It's an antagonist. And that's antagonist here. So oxytocin antagonist. And this is fairly straightforward. You want to just prevent preterm labor. Okay, so that's it for this pathway, just these two drugs. And let me move this a little bit. Are there any questions so far? Okay. All right, so this one has a few more things involved. So ADH is released in response to, like, let's say would be high osmolarity, right? So ADH is anti-diuretic hormone, so you want to retain more water. So retain water. Or increase blood pressure, things along that line. All right, so there are two types of receptors that ADH can bind to. So there is V1 and there's V2. So we normally think of, I'm going to go over V2 first because that's typically what people think of. So V2, you find it in the kidney, and that's the one that inserts aquaporin. That's the one that most people know about, but it's also in the endothelial cells. And that releases, and the stimulation of the receptor will help you release von Willebrand factor and factor 8. Okay. So in this pathway, the only one that's, so you can imagine if someone has central diabetes insipidus, so they're not making enough ADH, it would be helpful to give them ADH so that they can retain more water and insert the aquaporins. So agonist of here will be desmopressin. This is the 2 agonist. And things that you would use, so desmopressin can treat central diabetes insipidus. So that's the one where you're not making enough ADH. Or another important treatment that I'm not sure if they mentioned in Pharm, but it definitely did come up very much later on, is that you can use it for von Willebrand's disease. So you can use it to treat von Willebrand. So von Willebrand disease is when you have a defect of von Willebrand factor, and that can also lead to factor 8 being deficient. So if you give them desmopressin and more is released from the white blood bodies, then that could help with the von Willebrand's disease. And let's say if you have, actually I'll go over that later. So let's talk about V1 now. So the other receptor is in the GI tract, and that's in the smooth muscle. It makes them contract. And it's also in the vascular smooth muscle, and also makes them contract. There is one drug, and that's the terlipressin. And that you will use for things like to decrease bleeding from esophageal varices. Okay. So these are the agonists, and then we need to talk a little bit more about the antagonist. So there are two drugs that are that's kind of end in vaptan. So there's a conivaptan and a tolvaptan. This one is V1 and V2. This one is just V2. But they are both used for hyponatremia when you have the same or you have too much volume. So hyponatremia. So it helps to think about, like, let's say if you have too much ADH, then you're retaining a lot of water. So if you're retaining only water, then everything gets diluted, so you will get hyponatremia as well. So hyponatremia, and then ADH. So you're just making a lot of ADH, or if you have heart failure, or if you have cirrhosis, that can give you similar type of presentation. So you want to use same volume or too much volume. Okay, and then this will block both of these. And then you also have demecacycline. You guys remember from the block 3? Demecacycline would block just the ones in the kidney. And that would be useful to treat SIADH. Alright, are there any questions with this part? This is also fairly straightforward, and not too many drugs here. I'm gonna pause this.